Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our first question is from Patricia, who asks that tax credits are back with a vengeance in this election, and what are the best and the worst? My own feelings about tax credits are that they are largely bad because they don't really do what they're intended. Part of the intention is to, nudge people one way or the other into certain behaviors, and they don't really have the uptake on that, and we have data that proves that. Key point was the public transit tax credit. The uptake in ridership under the previous government, when they had that, was 0.25% to 1%. It really was not effective for the amount that it cost out of the Treasury. So with that in mind, I'm not really a fan of tax credits. I will say, however, that of the ones that the Conservatives are proposing, and it's largely just the Conservatives proposing them, that some of them this time around are refundable, which means that they are more accessible to lower income people. That means that they will still get something back even if they don't make enough income to pay income tax on them. That, however, is still predicated on the notion that they have enough money to spend for whatever the program is, whether it's children's sports or whatever. So you're still not likely to get much of the benefits because you likely don't have enough money to put into it. But even if they are able to do it, they don't make enough in a year to pay income tax, they will still get that tax credit back. So that's something, but overall, the tax credits as a whole are still largely a mechanism that is not terribly effective. We have a question here about the aftermath of the blackface revelations and wondering what the aftermath is in terms of polls and whether we're seeing regional differences beyond Quebec or any long-term damage. Now, personally, I don't pay a lot of attention to poll stories because I don't really like to be caught up in the narratives that develop out of them in terms of momentum and so on. I find they can be really hard to break out of when it comes to looking at issues on specific bases. Now, this being said, Abacus Data put out some interesting polling on this in the days after it happened. And one of the things I found interesting was that they specifically broke out reaction in terms of people who were visible minorities and people who weren't. And out of 24% of Canadians who were definitely offended and said that it changed their view, only 20 of those percent were visible minorities, so less than the whole of the Canadian public. Of the 34% of the public who said they didn't like it, but he apologized and they could move forward, that was 45% for people who were visible minority. So that gives us a little bit of a sense in terms of how the reaction's playing out in different communities. As well, 40% or 42% said didn't bother me really. That was 35% for visible minorities. So clearly it does bother them, but they felt that the apology was enough. I thought it was interesting that, at least we got that segment kind of broken out so that we could get a bit more of a sense how those particular communities were reacting to it. In terms of the overall numbers, nothing has really moved outside of the margin of error, either nationally or in any of the regional numbers that I could see when I went to take a look about that today. So I don't know that we are faced with any particular long-term damage, but it did move them a little bit, but we'll see if that has any further effect in the next couple of weeks. Our last question asks if this election feels more leader-centric than the 2015 one. To a certain extent, yes, partially because I think that there are two leaders in particular for whom the media focuses a lot on their personalities. That being, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. We have to remember that in 2017, it seemed to be the calculation of the NDP grassroots when they elected Mr. Singh to the leadership position was that there was kind of a sense that they wanted to out GQ Justin Trudeau, and they found someone who could do that for them. Unfortunately, that kind of wound up blowing up on them a little bit because, while he might be able to out GQ Trudeau in certain senses, he also did not have the same organizational capacity that Trudeau did. So, when we see that the NDP has, not really, they've been struggling in their fundraising and in nominations and so on, that's kind of an indication about how that kind of calculation didn't really pay for them in the long run. And I'm sure that there are a couple of the other leadership candidates from that contest who are kind of giving a bit of an "I told you so" right now. So anyway, that's partially why I think it is slightly more leader-centric. I think it's also just a fact that Canadian political media in general, with each successive election, gets more focused on leaders because we have become so used to the kind of Americana of political coverage that treats it like a presidential campaign. And it's not a presidential campaign, and yet that's the frame by which we think about things, because so much of our dominant media is bound in that frame, and so we think about it like that. And that's a problem. It's particularly a problem given that as voters, we need to be aware of who our local candidates are, because that's who we're actually voting for in the voting booth. So I think, as citizens, we need to try and pay a little less attention to the leaders and a little more attention to the local races and the people who are there, who are the ones who will be directly being elected by us and who will be representing us in our own ridings. So I think that as citizens and voters, we need to try and divorce ourselves from that coverage a little more and try and remain get back to that kind of focus. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.